What would you do if, one day, you caught a glimpse of a child's eyes, silent, heavy, and filled with quiet despair, peering out from beneath an old staircase? Thomas was only 8 years old when the world outside forgot he existed. Locked away in darkness for 4 long years, he no longer believed in miracles, until one man, a millionaire who had once lost everything, stepped quietly into that house and spoke a single word that changed everything. Enough. Thomas Whitaker was 75 years old. His name was etched on hospital walls, printed in scholarship brochures, and announced during fundraising galas. People often asked him the same question. How did you get here? How did a man like him come to build 2 children's hospitals, to fund trauma therapy centers across the country, to spend his life kneeling beside broken children, whispering, "I understand"? They expected a story filled with inspiration, a brilliant teacher perhaps, a near-death experience, a miracle. But miracles are tidy. His story was not. Thomas's story began under a staircase, in the dark, in silence, and in the company of monsters. He didn't remember much from his earliest years, but what had survived all those decades felt like a photograph left out in the rain. The center still clear, but the edges blurry and torn. His mother's laugh. That's what he remembered best. It had sounded like wind chimes dancing in a summer breeze. Her laughter lived in every corner of their small house, when she folded laundry while dancing to jazz, or when she tapped the spoon against the pot 3 times before pouring soup, like a secret rhythm meant only for him. She used to brush his hair with slow, patient strokes, even when he squirmed. She would hum Ella Fitzgerald and kiss the crown of his head. Her name had been Miriam. She died when he was 4. A car accident. Instant, they said. His father hadn't cried at the funeral. Not in front of him anyway. Walter Whitaker remarried 6 months later. Her name was Lorraine. And that was when everything Thomas knew about warmth began to rot. People rarely spoke of fathers like Walter. Not cruel, not abusive, just absent. Present in the way a ticking clock is present in the background, a shape in the room, but not a soul. Walter claimed to be a traveling salesman. He sold specialty hardware door to door, imported hinges, brass fixtures, custom drawer handles. He always smelled faintly of shaving cream and stale coffee. He wore cufflinks even when they didn't match his shirt. When he was home, he was polite, distant, detached. He never raised his voice, never laid a hand on Thomas, but he also never asked about the bruises, never noticed the way Thomas's frame shrank, never questioned why the boy winced when he stepped too close. Looking back, Thomas believed some part of his father knew that Lorraine's smiles stretched too tight, that Thomas's silence had depth, that something inside their home had turned rotten. But knowing and doing were oceans apart. And Walter chose to sail away. The business trips got longer. The phone calls came fewer. Eventually, the postcards stopped arriving altogether. And when he was gone, truly gone, Lorraine took off the mask. The first time she locked Thomas under the stairs, he was 5. It happened after he spilled a glass of milk on her carpet. He had said sorry. He remembered that part. He said sorry over and over again until his throat went raw. She said nothing, just grabbed his arm, dragged him across the floor, opened the little door beneath the staircase, and shoved him inside. He remembered thinking it was a punishment, a time out. But time didn't pass the same way in there. There was no light, no clock. Only the sound of his breathing, the distant hum of the refrigerator, and her footsteps overhead. No one came for him that night, or the next. He lived there for 4 years. People might picture something quaint, a dusty cupboard, a small mattress, a single light bulb. It wasn't. It was a crawl space, narrow, damp, rotting. The walls leaked in winter, mold crept up the corners. The smell of mildew was so thick it made him gag in his sleep. There was no blanket, just rags, no bathroom, just a bucket. It was a coffin that never closed. But the worst part? The rules. Rule 1, no sound. If he cried too loud, the door would fling open and her rage would pour in. Wooden spoons, broom handles, fists. If he whispered to himself, she would steal his blanket. If he made noise when guests were over, he wouldn't eat for days. Rule 2, no hope. Hope was the cruelest trick. It made him believe someone might notice, that a neighbor might hear, that a teacher might ask questions, that someone, anyone, might look into his eyes and say, "This isn't right." No one ever did. Rule 3, smile when called. When guests visited, Lorraine would paint a mask on him. She scrubbed him down, dressed him in stiff clothes that didn't fit, and forced him to sit at her side like some grotesque accessory. He wasn't allowed to speak unless spoken to. If he played the part well, he might get a crust of bread. If not, he'd be dragged back into the dark with a welt on his back and blood in his mouth. They called him such a polite boy. No one ever asked why he flinched when they touched his shoulder. He became her servant, her shadow, her punching bag. At 6, he was scrubbing floors with his bare hands. At 7, cleaning her bedroom, folding her laundry, polishing her wine glasses. By 8, he had forgotten what his own name sounded like. She never used it. He was it. That thing. You little mistake. Thomas didn't know how many birthdays he spent under the stairs. He didn't remember a single candle, but he remembered the hunger, the way it lived inside him like an echo. It made him hallucinate, whispered strange things in the dark. It dulled his fear, shrank his body, but kept his mind just awake enough to suffer. He began to fear the light, not for what it showed, but for what it meant. Light meant she remembered he existed. Light meant pain. So he learned to love the dark. What he remembered most clearly from those years was how small the world became. It narrowed to the width of that cupboard, the smell of rotting wood, the ache in his knees, the sound of Lorraine's heels on the stairs. He made friends with shadows, named the cracks in the wall, told himself stories to stay sane, Bible verses, fairy tales, fragments of songs he barely remembered. He didn't know why he didn't break completely. Maybe because he still had one thread of memory, one ghost to cling to. His mother, Miriam. She was gone, but not gone. She lived in his heartbeat. In the lullabies, he whispered when the pain was too much. In the smell of pancakes, he sometimes imagined drifting through the cracks. In the feel of her fingers buttoning his shirts, long ago. She saved him. Without ever being there, he didn't hate Lorraine, he feared her. Hate would have meant he still had energy left to fight. But in that place, under that staircase, there was no room for hatred, only survival. Even now, decades later, Thomas still woke up sometimes reaching for the wall. His wife had found him on the floor more times than he could admit, curled up, crying in his sleep, whispering things he didn't remember, because the body never forgets. He was 9 when everything changed, when someone finally looked, not glanced, not pitied, looked. You already know how the rest goes. The knock at the door, the man in the grey suit, the paper Thomas slid behind the flower vase, the word he shouted, enough. But before all that, there was a boy under the stairs, not angry, not brave, just waiting. And that's what you need to know before the hospitals, before the white coats and the speeches and the awards. Before people called him Dr. Whitaker, there was a boy. His name was Thomas. He lived in the dark. And one day, he made a choice, to reach for the light. There are memories that don't just live in your mind. They live under your skin, like glass splinters you've learned to live around. Thomas had many of them. But the first time he saw him, the man who would one day change everything, was one of the sharpest. It was a Tuesday. He remembered because Lorraine always deep-cleaned the house on Tuesdays. Her cleaning was less about hygiene and more about appearances. She scrubbed the wooden floors until the polish stung his eyes through the slats in the cupboard door. The house reeked of lemon-scented bleach and stale desperation. Tuesdays were the days she pretended to be someone else, not the woman who yanked him up by the hair or hurled soup into his lap. On Tuesdays, Lorraine was pleasant, at least until the guests were gone. That morning, Thomas listened from the dark. Curled into the corner where the damp wood met the cold wall, he waited. He always waited. For what, he didn't know. Then, 3 knocks. Sharp, clean, measured, not frantic like the mailman, not lazy like the meter reader. He froze. Lorraine stopped moving. He imagined her hands freezing on a dish rag, her mind suddenly racing. The door creaked open. Her voice came next, sugary and bright. "Oh, Mr. Whitmore, what a pleasant surprise." He didn't know that name yet, but he would never forget it. Thomas leaned closer to the cupboard door. It was old and warped with age. If he tilted his head just right, he could hear every word, every footstep on the creaking floorboards. "I hope I'm not interrupting," said the man. His voice was different, calm, confident, deliberate, not the barking tone of a salesman, not nasal or loud, steady, like it belonged to someone who didn't need to raise it to be heard. "I was told this address had a few pieces of mid-century porcelain, possibly Tang Dynasty replicas." Lorraine laughed. Too loud, too fake. "Oh, absolutely. My husband was quite the collector. Please come in. Forgive the state of the place. I wasn't expecting guests." Thomas heard the door shut. 2 sets of shoes across the hardwood floor, moving toward the display room. He knew that room well. High velvet curtains, a dark wood piano. The last trace of his father's love for beautiful things. He didn't know why he kept listening. Maybe it was the man's voice. Maybe it was the way each word was carefully chosen, never rushed. The man asked about the glaze, the age, the markings. Lorraine stumbled through answers, making up terms she didn't understand. Thomas imagined her smiling too hard, hoping this stranger would offer money. And then a sound escaped him. He hadn't meant to make it. He had been sick the night before, feverish, trembling. His throat still burned, and his hands shook as he reached for the dented tin cup Lorraine sometimes remembered to leave. But his elbow knocked it over. The metal hit the floor with a crash. It rolled, clattering across the boards, and struck the wall with a dull thud. Silence. The vacuum stopped. The dishes stilled. Even Lorraine went quiet. Then came the man's voice, measured, gentle, curious. "Is someone else here?" Lorraine's reply was quick, high-pitched. "Oh no, just the old plumbing. You know how these houses are. Moan and groan like they're haunted." Another pause. Then the sound of footsteps. His footsteps, moving toward the stairs. Thomas's heart thundered in his chest. He shrank into the far corner of the cupboard, curling into himself like a wounded animal. He didn't want to be seen, not like this, not covered in grime, not shaking like a trapped rat. But it was too late. The door creaked. The rusted hinge gave way, and it swung open just a few inches. Light spilled in, soft, golden, blinding. And through that sliver of light, the man saw him. For a moment, the world stopped turning. Thomas sat with his knees drawn to his chest. His shirt was torn, his face sticky with something he didn't remember eating. He hadn't bathed in days. His hair hung in greasy strands over his eyes. But he looked at the man, and the man looked back. He was tall, trim, older. Silver hair touched his temples, and his clean suit didn't wrinkle even when he leaned slightly forward. But none of that mattered. It was his eyes. First, confusion, then realization. Then something Thomas didn't have a name for yet. The man didn't look away, and for the first time in Thomas's life, someone saw him. Not as an inconvenience, not as a thing, as a boy. Thomas thought he might say something, ask who he was, ask if he was okay. He imagined, for one breathless second, that the man would kneel down, gently place a hand on his shoulder, and say the words he had dreamed of for years. "You don't belong here. I'm taking you home." Hope surged so fast it hurt. But then, Lorraine. She moved faster than he'd ever seen her move, stepped between them like a curtain snapping shut. "Oh, I see you've found the old storage closet," she said with a brittle laugh. "Forgive the mess. That's just... well, that's Thomas, my husband's boy. Poor thing. Not all there, if you know what I mean." The man didn't blink. Neither did Thomas. "He's not dangerous," Lorraine continued, her voice pitched somewhere between sweetness and panic. "Just slow. Doctors said he might never talk right. You know how it is." The man looked at her, then at Thomas, and something changed in his face. The warmth drained, the softness vanished. He straightened his coat. "I think I've seen enough," he said quietly. Then he turned. He walked away, not fast, not slow, but certain. Thomas heard the front door open, then close, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. It filled the house, it filled his chest, and then Lorraine turned on him, her face twisted with fury. "You just cost me a deal, you little rat." He braced himself. That night, there was no food, no water. She hit him with the heel of her shoe so hard, his ear rang for 3 days. He bled into his pillow and didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because he had no tears left. She threatened to seal the cupboard shut, and he believed her. But none of that, the bruises, the blood, the hunger, none of it hurt as much as those few seconds under the light. Because, for the first time in his life, he had been seen, and then unseen, not rejected, worse, dismissed, like he didn't matter, like he wasn't worth saving. Thomas didn't know then what seeds had been planted that day, didn't know how close the man had come to coming back, didn't know that something had already shifted inside him, quietly, like the tide changing beneath a full moon. All he knew was that he had climbed halfway up the ladder of hope, and then fallen, back into the dark, back into waiting, always waiting, for someone who might come again. This time, for real. This time, to stay. After that day, the day their eyes met through the narrow crack in the cupboard, something shifted. At first, it didn't seem like much. Nothing outside changed. Lorraine was still Lorraine, sharp-tongued and cruel, as unpredictable as a summer storm. The cupboard remained dark and damp, its corners growing mold where the wood had swelled. Thomas still fell asleep with his arms wrapped around his knees, teeth chattering from hunger and cold. His ribs still ached from her last kick. His cheek still stung from where her ring had split the skin. But something in the air had changed. It was small, barely there, like a whisper after years of silence. Maybe it was the way Lorraine moved faster than usual, snapped more, checked the locks twice. Thomas couldn't be sure, but he thought she was nervous, as if that brief crack in the cupboard door had let in more than just a sliver of light. It had let in possibility, and possibility to someone like Lorraine was dangerous. So she tightened the rules. No noise unless spoken to, no scratching, no coughing, no movement when guests were over, and especially, no signs of life. But about a week later, he heard the voice again. It was early morning. The house smelled of vinegar cleaner and the scorched remains of Lorraine's latest failed attempt at breakfast. She always burned the toast. Thomas was tucked beneath the stairs, trying to be smaller than his own shadow, when he heard it. 3 soft knocks, a pause, and then the door opened. "Well, Mr. Whitmore," Lorraine said, her tone flat and strained. "Back again?" "Just in the neighborhood," came the reply. Calm, measured, familiar. It was him, the man with the steady voice and silver-streaked hair, the one who had seen him. "I was hoping to take another look at that vase, the blue and white one. I believe I missed a maker's mark." Thomas pressed his ear to the wood. He could hear the pause in Lorraine's breath, the mental calculus behind her silence. He still represented money, or so she believed. "Fine," she said at last, "but don't expect tea service this time." He entered. Thomas didn't move. He didn't dare. But he listened. He memorized the rhythm of the man's footsteps, soft soles on worn hardwood, unhurried and deliberate. He passed the cupboard, didn't open it, but he stopped. He stood still, just for a moment. Thomas felt it, the subtle shift in air pressure. For one suspended breath, he thought he could feel the man's gaze on the wood, not pushing, just checking. Then the footsteps moved on, and he left. That afternoon, Lorraine yanked open the cupboard door and threw in a broom. "Clean the corners," she snapped. She didn't notice what had been left behind, but Thomas did, tucked behind a beam, carefully placed in the only spot someone living in the cupboard would notice. Was a book. Not new, not shiny, but clean, intact. The Velveteen Rabbit. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The edges were soft from use. The spine cracked slightly as he opened it. Inside the front cover, in neat, slightly slanted handwriting, was a simple note. "I thought you might like this. A." That was it. No threats, no instructions, just a gift. The first time in years, someone had given him something without pain in return. He stared at the book for what felt like hours before daring to hide it beneath the rags. Not under the floorboard, not out in the open. Carefully, reverently. Between the blanket and the wall, far enough back that Lorraine wouldn't see it if she peeked in. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He just held the book to his chest. After that, the man kept coming. Not every day, but often enough that Thomas began to wait for him. Each time, he arrived with a new question, about a different piece of porcelain or a chipped saucer he said he had missed. Lorraine rolled her eyes every time, but greed dulled suspicion. She let him in, always polite, always casual, but always lingering near the stairs. And after he left, Thomas would find something: a folded towel, a box of saltine crackers, a pair of socks, clean and slightly worn, but warm, a paper napkin wrapped around 2 boiled eggs, never enough to raise alarm. But to Thomas, they were treasure. They were evidence. He had been seen. He didn't know what to call the feeling building in his chest. It wasn't hope. Not yet. He didn't trust hope. Hope made you soft, and soft got you hurt. But something new had entered his world. He started listening for him in the mornings, pressed his ear against the cupboard door. His heart would leap at the sound of the floorboard creaking beneath those careful steps. He memorized the cadence of the walk, the inflection in the voice. He called him something in his mind, the man with the sad eyes, because that's what they were, sad. Not like Lorraine's, which were cold and vacant. Her eyes were hollowed out by bitterness. His sadness was different. It had depth, like someone who had once known joy and lost it, like someone who had seen something once and never recovered. One day, after he left, Thomas found something different. It wasn't food or clothing or anything practical. It was art, a thick piece of drawing paper folded carefully. On one side, a pencil sketch, a boy sitting beneath a window, thin but not broken, holding a book in his lap, a beam of sunlight falling across him like a gentle hand. The lines were soft, delicate, drawn by someone who knew what shadows looked like. On the back, in the same slanted hand, were 8 quiet words. If you ever need help, put this paper by the front window. No name, no signature, no instructions, just a choice. Thomas stared at it for hours. His fingers traced the edge of the page again and again. What did he mean? Help? How? When? Could he trust it? Or worse, what if it was a trap? What if Lorraine found it? What if she caught him trying to place it? What if the man hadn't really meant it? That night, he didn't sleep. He held the paper to his chest and listened to the house breathe. He listened to the refrigerator click, to Lorraine's footsteps, to the wind moaning through the cracked windows. He unfolded and refolded the paper until the edges went soft and the crease in the center bent like a heartbeat. He didn't place it by the window. Not that night. He couldn't. Not yet. But he didn't throw it away either. He hid it, buried deep in his corner, under the book, beneath the socks, wrapped in a clean napkin. It wasn't a signal. Not yet. But it was something else. A thread. Something to hold on to. It would take him weeks to act. But that one sketch, that one silent gesture, was enough to stir something long buried. Because sometimes kindness doesn't shout. It doesn't come with sirens or spotlights or grand rescues. Sometimes it slips under a doorframe, pauses outside a cupboard, whispers, "I see you." And in a world built on silence, that's the loudest sound there is. It was early autumn when the news arrived. The first signs of the season crept in like whispers. Cooler evenings, the scent of leaves beginning to rot into the earth, the dry rustle of wind slipping through thinning trees. From his place beneath the stairs, Thomas could smell it all through the cracks in the warped wood, feel the chill creeping in through the insulation gaps long since given up. Lorraine was on the phone that afternoon. Again. She'd been pacing the house for hours, smoking one cigarette after another until the kitchen reeked of burnt paper and anxiety. Her footsteps echoed like a metronome, sharp, impatient, relentless. He couldn't hear the exact words, but the tone, that he understood, clipped, brittle, sharper than usual. Something had rattled her. Then, silence. Real silence. No muttering, no slamming drawers, no glasses clinking. Just stillness. And in that house, silence never meant peace. It meant something was brewing, something worse than usual. Later that night, Thomas peeked through the narrow slats in the cupboard door and saw her standing in front of the living room window. The record player had spun its last track, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock. In her hand was a plain white envelope, slightly crumpled at the corners. She wasn't opening it, just holding it, clutching it like something alive might leap out and disappear. Her other hand trembled as she raised a cigarette to her lips. She didn't speak. She didn't curse. She just stared into the dark beyond the glass, as if waiting for someone or daring them to come. Thomas couldn't see the letter's contents, but he already knew. The next morning confirmed everything his gut had whispered. Lorraine never told him directly. She didn't need to. That was how her cruelty worked, not through confrontation, but through omission, through things left unsaid, through things a child was forced to learn in silence. He heard her on the phone again. This time she was laughing, bitter, hollow. The sound didn't touch her eyes. "Yep," she said loudly, performatively. "Confirmed dead. Car accident in Michigan. Body's gone. Just a burned-out wreck." A pause, then colder than frostbite. No will, no insurance, just debts and that damn kid. That damn kid. Thomas. His father was dead. Just like that. No goodbye, no visit, no apology, no final look. Just flames on a distant highway and a second-hand confirmation in a government envelope. And suddenly, there was nothing holding Lorraine back. No need to pretend anymore. No looming threat of a father returning. No accountability. No leash. She stopped feeding him. Not skipped meals. Stopped. Days passed with nothing but the crust of a forgotten sandwich or water stolen from the laundry room sink. The hunger became constant, a hum in his bones. More than pain, it became identity. He forgot what it felt like to be full. His ribs jutted out. His gums bled. His fingernails cracked and split from the cold. He stopped waiting for food, started fantasizing about chewing paper. He was fading, slowly, painfully, and still, he hadn't expected what came next. The first stranger arrived on a Friday. Thomas recognized immediately that he was different. He didn't knock. He just walked in, boots caked in mud, the kind of man who took up space deliberately. His coat was leather, stained. His voice deep and casual, like the world no longer had the power to surprise him. Lorraine greeted him with a laugh Thomas had never heard before. Too sweet, too eager. She offered him a drink from the dusty cabinet she rarely touched. They sat in the living room. Thomas listened from behind the cupboard door, barely daring to breathe. "I'm not looking for trouble," the man said. "You won't get any," Lorraine replied. They laughed again. And then she said it. "He's quiet. Doesn't talk. And no one checks in anymore." Thomas froze. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She was trying to get rid of him. Not to a shelter. Not to a foster home. She was going to sell him. After that, the strangers came more often. One wore cologne so strong it seeped through the cracks and made him gag. Another reeked of gasoline. Some didn't speak at all. They just walked the house, looked around, asked vague questions. One of them asked, "Can I see the boy?" Another joked, "How much for the mute?" And Lorraine, she laughed. She laughed like it was funny. That night, Thomas couldn't stop shaking. Not from cold, from fear. He curled into the corner of his cupboard, jaw clenched so tight, it ached. He tried not to cry. Crying made noise. Noise got punished, but his body betrayed him. Tears spilled silently into the rags he used as a blanket. He had survived beatings, starvation, humiliation. But this wasn't just pain. This was annihilation. This was the end of him. Not with a scream, but with a signature, with a deal. And then he remembered the paper, the sketch, the boy in the drawing sitting in a patch of light. A book in his lap. Sunlight falling like a hand. And the words Mr. Andrew had written. "If you ever need help, put this paper by the front window." He hadn't touched it in weeks. Too scared. Too unsure it was real. Too afraid it might make things worse. But now, it was this, or vanish. Thomas crawled to the edge of the cupboard and retrieved the paper from its hiding place beneath the floorboard. His hands shook as he unfolded it. The edges were frayed, the corners stained. But the message was still there, still clear. His heart thundered so loudly he thought it might echo through the floor. Every instinct screamed it was a mistake, that he'd be caught, beaten, erased. But something deeper whispered, "Do it." He waited until the house went still. Lorraine had passed out on the couch, her drink spilled beside her. The record player spun in static. He knew her rhythm. She'd be out for at least an hour. It was now or never. He opened the cupboard door an inch. Just enough. No creak. Thank God. He slid out, belly to the floor, like he had so many times when she forced him to scrub the hallway. But this time wasn't obedience. This time was survival. The front window was 4 feet away, 4 feet of terror, of hope, of everything. He crawled forward, breath ragged, reached the sill, shifted the vase, tucked the paper behind it, angled just enough so someone, anyone, outside might see, just in case. Then he crawled back, quiet, quick, like a shadow. When he slid the cupboard door shut behind him, he was drenched in sweat. His fingers trembled, his stomach churned, and then he waited. He didn't sleep that night, didn't blink. He sat in the dark, knees pulled to chest, forehead pressed to wrists, and he whispered one word, again and again, barely audible, but with every part of his being. Please, please, please. If he saw it, if he still remembered, if he hadn't forgotten the boy in the shadows, maybe, just maybe, he'd come. And if he didn't, at least Thomas had tried. For the first time in his life, he had made a choice, not out of fear, not just to survive, but to reach for something else, for light. Morning came the same way it always did, in silence and cold. But that day, something felt heavier. Maybe it was the air, or maybe it was the weight of everything that hadn't yet happened. Thomas had barely slept. His bones ached from the hard wooden floor. The damp of the cupboard had soaked into his skin, making his knees sting where the splinters had dug in. The stale smell of mold was so familiar now. It clung to him like an old shirt no one had ever washed. His eyes were half closed when the cupboard door burst open. No knock, no warning. Lorraine's shadow filled the doorway like a storm cloud. "Get up," she barked. "Now!" Thomas scrambled out, more out of reflex than understanding. He hadn't earned words like please in years. His legs were stiff, his head throbbed. He hadn't eaten since the day before, unless the crust of bread he'd stolen from the trash counted. Her hand gripped the back of his shirt, yanking him upright. The collar dug into his neck. She didn't look at him. She never did. She dragged him down the hallway and into the kitchen. The cold floor bit into his bare feet. Her heels clacked like hammers, her steps fueled by rage. Her hair was wild, twisted into a half knot. She smelled of cigarettes, gin, and unfiltered fury. The bottle from last night still sat on the counter, half empty, half forgotten. "You want to act like an animal?" she hissed, shoving him toward the cracked tile near the fridge. "Fine. You'll eat like one." He blinked, dazed, until he saw it. A paper plate, on the floor, covered in old food, greasy eggs turned a sickly green, a shriveled sausage, and what might have once been a pancake, now stuck to the tile with syrup, dust, and dirt. Bits of hair clung to it. Something red was smeared across the edge, something he couldn't identify. It wasn't just garbage, it was a message. "Go on," Lorraine snarled. Her arms crossed. A smile curved across her face in the cruelest way. "Eat it, every damn bite." Thomas stared at the food, his stomach twisted with hunger and shame. He'd eaten worse. Moldy bread, dog kibble, even soap once. But this, something in him pushed back. I... His voice cracked, barely audible. Lorraine stepped forward, towering. "What? Now you're too good for it." He didn't answer. Wrong move. Her hand whipped across his face. The slap hit him full force, sending him crashing sideways. His hip slammed into the corner of the cabinet. His cheek burned, hot and stinging. "I said EAT. He curled in on himself, one hand catching the floor, the other shielding his head. But she wasn't done. She grabbed him by the hair and dragged him toward the plate until his face hovered inches above it. The smell made bile rise in his throat. "You think you're clever," she snarled, shaking him, "leaving your little message by the window. You think someone's coming, huh? You think you matter to anyone out there? Her voice cracked with rage. You're nothing, she spat. Do you hear me? Nothing. He didn't answer. He couldn't. She shoved his face closer to the plate, and his hands instinctively caught the floor to keep from falling into the mess. Eat it, she said again. Like the dirty little stray you are. Thomas tried to pull away, but her foot came down on his leg, pinning him in place. His arms trembled, his ribs screamed. The room began to spin. His eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. And then, crack. The front door exploded open. The sound was deafening. Not a knock, not a creak. It had been kicked in. They both froze. Lorraine spun around, hand dropping from his hair. What the hell? Footsteps, heavy, fast, deliberate, boots on hardwood. Then a voice, low, steady, slicing through the tension like a blade. Step away from him. And then he appeared. Mr. Andrew, but not in a suit, not the calm, composed version of the man Thomas remembered. He looked like a storm given form, winded but unshaken. His coat flared behind him, half unbuttoned. His expression wasn't peaceful. It was fury, righteous, controlled, but on the edge of something explosive. And when his eyes found Thomas, curled on the floor, surrounded by filth, Lorraine standing over him, something in the man's chest cracked. He stepped forward, pointed straight at her. Enough! The word didn't just echo. It took up the entire room. Lorraine staggered back, half a step, blinking. You can't just come in here. I can, he roared. And I did. Behind him, as if summoned by that single word, came a procession. 2 uniformed officers. A woman in a charcoal coat, a CPS badge clipped to her chest, a man in a suit, carrying a leather briefcase, and every single one of them wore the same look. They knew. Mr. Andrew moved forward, stepping between Thomas and Lorraine, his arms spread wide, shielding the boy completely. Step away from the boy. Lorraine flinched, but pride dug in. He's mentally unstable, she screamed. He lies. He makes things up. I've taken care of him for years. What have you done? The CPS worker stepped in. Her voice was calm, firm. Ma'am, we have a court-approved emergency removal order. Medical records, photos, statements. You are no longer his guardian. He is coming with us. You can't take him, Lorraine howled. He's not even mine by blood. You don't know what I've had to deal with. No, Mr. Andrew said quietly. But we know what he's been through. One of the officers moved in. Ma'am, step away from the child. Lorraine's face turned crimson. Don't touch me. You're all insane. He's nothing. You said that, Mr. Andrew murmured, right before you shoved his face into garbage. Her mouth opened, then shut. They read her rights there in the kitchen. She screamed, called Thomas names, called them names, said they were liars, devils, monsters. But no one listened anymore. She was cuffed, still fighting, still flailing, her sobs trailing down the hall as they dragged her out. And then, silence. Thomas remained on the floor. He hadn't moved. His face still hovered above the plate. His hands shook beneath him. It didn't feel real. He expected to be slapped awake, dragged back into the cupboard, told it was all a dream. Then, a hand. On his shoulder. Not rough, not yanking. Warm, steady, human. Mr. Andrew knelt beside him. I've got you, he said. Thomas looked up. The rage in the man's eyes had faded. In its place. Something Thomas had never seen directed at him before. Gentleness. Not pity. Not fear. Care. Mr. Andrew reached for him, slowly. Can you walk? Thomas tried. His legs buckled. Andrew caught him without hesitation. And then he lifted him, not like trash, not like a burden, like something precious, Janice, the CPS worker, stepped forward. She wrapped Thomas in a blanket, warm, soft. "We're here now," she whispered. "You're not going back." Mr. Andrew carried him through the kitchen, past the mouldy sink, past the broken cupboard, and through the front door, into the light. It hit Thomas like fire, blinding, real. He turned his face away instinctively, squinted. Tears stung his eyes. But they weren't from pain. They were from the absence of it. He had lived 4 years in shadows. Now, for the first time, he was being carried into the world. Not hidden, seen. As they reached the car, Mr. Andrew whispered, "You're safe now, Thomas. You're safe." And for the first time since the day his mother left in an ambulance and never came back, he believed it. The first night Thomas slept in Mr. Andrew's house, he didn't sleep at all. The home, no, the estate, was unlike anything he had ever known. It was warm, filled with soft light and the scent of cinnamon and freshly laundered linen. The room they gave him was bigger than the entire hallway he had spent years crawling through. The sheets were soft, the pillows were fluffed. The bed was so wide, he didn't even know where to lie. On the nightstand sat a small lamp, a folded set of clothes, and his favorite, a book, The Velveteen Rabbit, the same book Andrew had once left for him when he wasn't sure the boy hiding behind the cupboard door would ever see him as more than a shadow. It was too much, too quiet, too clean, too free. That night, Thomas curled into a tight ball on the edge of the bed. Maybe it was instinct. He didn't trust the middle. He needed a boundary, a wall, a place to hide. He didn't remember falling asleep, but he remembered waking up, screaming. In the dream, he was back under the stairs. Only this time, the walls were closing in. Literally. The plaster cracked. The ceiling caved. The pressure stole his breath. Lorraine was outside the door, laughing. Someone knocked, once, twice, 3 times, but no one came in. Thomas jolted upright, drenched in sweat, chest heaving. Then he heard it. A door creaked open, down the hall. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Then the door to his room eased inward. Just a little. "Thomas?" It was Andrew. His voice was quiet, steady. Thomas couldn't answer. He could barely see. Andrew didn't turn on the light. He didn't startle him with questions or noise. He just stepped inside and sat down in the armchair by the window. "I'm right here," he said. And somehow, Thomas fell asleep again, not because the fear was gone, but because someone stayed. The days that followed were strange. He was fed 3 meals a day. There was always fruit, eggs, soup, even cookies once. Thomas didn't know what to do with a cookie. He kept saving half of everything on his plate, afraid someone might take it away if he didn't hoard it first. Every time someone said his name, Thomas, he flinched. He wasn't used to hearing it spoken gently. Doors terrified him. When one slammed, even by accident, he dropped to the floor, arms over his head, trembling. Andrew never scolded him. He would simply crouch down beside him, never too close, and say things like, "It's just the wind," or "Nothing here will hurt you." Andrew brought in a therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Lynn. She didn't make him sit in a circle. She didn't ask about his feelings. Instead, she handed him colored pencils. "Do you like to draw?" she asked. At first he drew boxes, then closed spaces, then doors, then cracks in doors, then eyes. His eyes. Andrew's. The ones that had seen him when no one else would. Andrew also hired a teacher, Mr. Byron, younger, wore glasses and cozy sweaters with elbow patches. He never made Thomas feel stupid when he couldn't spell something. "You're not behind, Thomas," he said. "You've just been waiting for the world to catch up to you." They started with letters, then numbers, then books. Thomas had never gone to school. Not properly, but slowly, the fog began to lift. Andrew joined them for lunch every day. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. One afternoon, maybe a month after Thomas arrived, they sat together under the big oak tree in the backyard. It was early October. Leaves were falling in golden sheets across the grass. Andrew brought hot cocoa for both of them. Thomas didn't talk much yet, but he had started asking little questions. What's that? What kind of bird is that? Why do leaves turn orange? Andrew always answered. That day, he looked at Thomas for a long moment before saying quietly, I had a son. Thomas didn't move. He was 8, Andrew said, his eyes drifting toward the sky. Just about your age. He got sick, very sick, and there wasn't anything anyone could do. He didn't cry, but his voice wavered. I shut everyone out for a long time after that, he continued. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, the grief would go away. A pause. It didn't. Then he looked back at Thomas. But when I saw you, something changed. Not because you reminded me of him, but because you were you, and I couldn't walk away from that. Thomas didn't know what to say, but he leaned just a little bit closer, and Andrew smiled. Over the weeks that followed, the walls Thomas had built around himself began to shift. He started sleeping without curling into a ball. He asked for seconds at dinner. He laughed once, and it scared him. The sound felt strange in his throat. He painted with Dr. Lynn. He read Charlotte's Web with Mr. Byron. He played a game of chess with Andrew, and won, though he suspected Andrew let him. He began to understand what it meant to be safe, and slowly, what it meant to be loved. They never said it out loud, not at first, but it was there. In the way Andrew always set a plate across from his at dinner, in the way he waited in the hallway outside Thomas's door until the boy fell asleep, in the way he said, "Good morning, Thomas," like it was the most important sentence in the world. They were building something. Not fast, not perfect, but real. And for a boy who had only ever known darkness, it felt like sunrise. It didn't take long for the court date to be set. By that point, Thomas had been living with Mr. Andrew for just over 3 months. The bruises had faded. The weight was slowly returning to his frame. He had learned to sleep, most nights, without waking up in a scream. But the scars, those didn't fade as easily. They lived beneath his skin, in silence, in dreams. When Andrew sat him down and told him the trial was approaching, Thomas froze. "Will she be there?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Andrew didn't lie. "Yes." Thomas didn't say anything for a long time. His fingers twisted the hem of his shirt. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He just nodded. "I want to go." Andrew reached across the table and covered the boy's hand with his own. "You don't have to," he said gently. "We have everything we need. Medical reports, CPS evaluations, witness statements. You won't be forced." "I want to," Thomas repeated, this time with more resolve. "I need to." The courthouse smelled of paper and floor polish. Its high ceilings loomed like the inside of a cathedral, but without the sanctuary. Footsteps echoed. Voices murmured behind closed doors. Thomas sat beside Andrew on one of the long wooden benches, his posture rigid, his shirt buttoned all the way to the collar. His shoes were too tight, but they gleamed with polish. A small sign of care. Janice, the CPS caseworker, sat nearby, a quiet guardian. When the doors opened and Lorraine was brought in, Thomas's breath caught. She wore an orange jumpsuit and shackles. Her wrists and ankles clinked softly with every step. But what stunned Thomas wasn't the sound. It was her size. She looked small, not weak, but smaller than the towering figure who had once haunted his nights. Her hair was pulled back so tight it lifted her eyebrows. Her face was pale, the skin drawn and lined with frustration. Her eyes darted around the room like those of a trapped animal. When she saw him, she narrowed her eyes into slits, but he didn't flinch. Not this time. The prosecutor presented the case methodically. Photos of bruises, medical reports, expert testimony, statements from social workers, even the food-stained rags Thomas had once called his bedding. Lorraine pled not guilty, of course. She claimed it was all exaggerated, claimed he was unwell, claimed she did the best she could with what she was given. But the judge wasn't buying it, and neither was the jury. Then came the part Thomas had agreed to: testimony. They called his name. He stood up, walked slowly to the stand. His legs trembled, but only slightly. His palms were damp. His throat is dry. But he stood tall. Andrew was in the front row, nodding. His expression is full of quiet strength. Thomas raised his hand, swore his oath. His voice cracked when he answered, yes. The lawyer only asked one question. Thomas, is there anything you'd like to say to the court about your experience living with the defendant? He turned his gaze to Lorraine. She was watching him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if bracing against something she couldn't name, as if she still believed she could intimidate him into silence. He took a breath, and then said simply, "She can't take away another day of my future." A pause. No one moved. That was it. That was all he needed to say. Because this wasn't about revenge. He wasn't there to scream or shout or make her feel the pain he had endured. That would have made her too important. She had already taken enough, years he couldn't get back. But not this. Not him. Not anymore. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. The word rang through the courtroom with quiet finality, heavier than any gavel could strike. Lorraine was convicted on multiple counts: child abuse, unlawful confinement, and psychological endangerment of a minor. The judge's ruling was firm. Lorraine would serve time in state prison, followed by probation. She would have no right to appeal for custody or guardianship of any child ever again. She also lost all legal claim to Walter Whitaker's estate. His pension, the house, any savings, all of it was stripped from her and redirected toward Thomas's care and education. When she was led away in cuffs, she didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just stared at the floor, her shoulders hunched, as if the weight of her own cruelty had finally found her. Thomas didn't feel joy. He didn't feel sorrow either. He felt still, like a door had clicked shut behind him, and this time he was walking away. Outside, the air was crisp. The sky is a perfect blue. Thomas and Andrew walked side by side down the courthouse steps. "Proud of you," Andrew said simply. Thomas nodded. Andrew didn't ask how he felt. He didn't need to. They got into the car, buckled their seatbelts, turned on the heat. As the engine started, Andrew looked over and asked, "You hungry?" And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, Thomas smiled. Yes. After Lorraine went to prison, Andrew hadn't hesitated. Within the year, he officially adopted Thomas. People had called it unusual. A widower, a man his age, taking in a boy so damaged, so quiet. But Andrew had never treated him like a project. He never treated him like a burden or a box to be checked. He treated him like a son, and that made all the difference. With Andrew's help and the guidance of therapists, teachers, and kind souls along the way, Thomas began to build a life. He went to school. He struggled at first, yes, but he was hungry. Hungry for knowledge, for words, for the kind of freedom that came from learning. In high school, he discovered a passion for biology. He was drawn to the order of it, the clarity of cause and effect, the marvel that the human body could endure so much pain and still heal, still grow, still breathe. He became a doctor, Not because he wanted to fix people, but because he wanted to stand beside them during their worst moments and say, "I've been there. You're not alone." For 35 years, Thomas worked as a pediatric trauma specialist. He held the hands of children who had been beaten, burned, abandoned. He looked into their eyes and saw pieces of himself. He couldn't erase their pain, but he could witness it. He could honor it. He could speak for those too hurt to speak for themselves. Later, he founded a non-profit, the Light Beneath the Stairs Foundation, dedicated to providing counseling, transitional housing, and legal advocacy for children escaping abuse. In the past 20 years, that foundation had helped over 4,000 kids. People often asked him, "Where did you find the strength?" He never said the answer was easy, because the truth was, he didn't find it alone. Andrew passed away 30 years later, quietly, in his sleep, in the very home where he had once carried a trembling boy out of the shadows and into the light. That morning, Thomas sat beside him for a long time, holding his hand. Andrew had never told him what exactly drove him to return that day. The day he burst through the front door and shouted one word that split a life in half. Enough. But Thomas knew it had cost him something. Andrew had carried his own grief. He had buried a son, faced a pain that could have hollowed him out forever. But he chose to see another child. He chose to act. And that changed everything. Thomas never married. He never had children of his own. But he loved. He mentored. He stood in courtrooms beside young survivors who had no one else, and he spoke for them. He never said he was healed. Healing, he believed, wasn't a destination. It was a road. A rough, winding, imperfect road that had to be walked one step at a time. Some days, the old voices still whispered. Some nights, the dark still felt too close. But he kept walking, because now he knew what it meant to walk in the sun. Above his desk, framed and carefully preserved, hung an old drawing, the same one Andrew had left behind the vase so many years ago. A boy, sitting beneath a window, thin but not broken, light spilling across the pages of the book in his lap. Thomas had kept that drawing all his life. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the boy he had once been, scared, starving, silent, and he remembered the moment that boy made a choice. To reach out. To believe, if only for a second, that someone might listen. That belief didn't save him, but it started the saving. Thomas Whitaker never really left the cupboard under the stairs, though he went on to become a doctor, a philanthropist, a man who built 2 children's hospitals and funded trauma recovery programs across the country. Part of him still lived in the dark, in silence. Curled in a corner, no one could see. The shadows from that time never fully disappeared. They visited him in dreams, in the quiet moments after midnight, in the way he sometimes flinched when doors closed too fast or voices rose too sharply. The pain of the past didn't vanish. It simply learned how to wear different clothes. But Thomas never let it own him. He used it. He turned darkness into fuel and pain into purpose. Throughout his decades of work, he did more than heal wounds. He noticed the things others didn't. The boy who never spoke, the girl who didn't like being touched, the child who always said they were fine, even when their eyes told a different story. Thomas knew what to listen for in the silence. He had once lived there himself. He never became rich by traditional standards. He didn't care for fame. But when he died, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by friends, nurses, and dozens of framed drawings made by children, he left behind something bigger than legacy. He left behind light. When asked about his success, Thomas never spoke of wealth or accolades. He spoke of his mother, Miriam, who made pancakes and sang jazz on Sunday mornings. He spoke of the drawing Mr. Andrew had given him, and the note that read, "If you ever need help, put this in the window." He spoke of a day in early autumn when the man in the grey suit kicked open the front door and shouted, "Enough." One word. But for Thomas, it was everything. It was the first time someone had drawn a line in the sand and said, "This ends now." Because sometimes it doesn't take a miracle to save someone. Sometimes it just takes one person who's willing to look, to notice, to care, to say, "That's not okay." Sometimes all it takes is you. So now, a question for you. Have you ever seen someone like Thomas? A child who's always quiet in class. A neighbor who never answers the door. A kid who seems too mature, too careful, too invisible. In our busy, noisy world, how many people are quietly crying out, without words, hoping someone might notice? And if you did notice, would you speak up? Would you be the person who says, "Enough"? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share. Not for us, but for the ones who still live in the dark, waiting for someone to open the door. Because sometimes you might be the light they've been hoping to see. Thank you for spending your precious time with us. May your days be filled with warmth, meaning, good health, and quiet moments that remind you, you are never alone. See you in next story.